A few months ago, a man walked into my GameStop store and asked me for a job. The strange part wasn't that he needed work. The strange part was that he used to be my boss. And not just my boss either. For almost 2 years, he had made my life miserable. He stole credit for my work, humiliated me in front of coworkers, sabotaged my schedule, and did everything he could to remind me that he had power, and I didn't. Back then, he loved making people feel small. Now he was standing in front of me looking like he hadn't slept in days. The expensive suits were gone. The confidence was gone. Even his posture was different. He looked nervous, desperate. "Michael," he said quietly, rubbing his hands together, "I was hoping maybe you could put in a good word for me." I just stared at him. This was Brandon. The same Brandon who acted like everyone around him was beneath him. The same Brandon who believed he was destined for corporate leadership. The same Brandon who spent years treating hardworking employees like disposable tools. And now he was standing in the very store he used to manage, asking me for help. What made it even crazier was that a year earlier, he probably would have laughed if someone had told him this moment was coming. As I looked at him, memories of everything that had happened came rushing back. Every insult, every schedule change, every time he took credit for someone else's work, every time he made another employee dread coming into work. And I realized it had all started with one meeting. At the time, I was 38 years old and working at a GameStop location in a busy shopping center. I wasn't a manager, and I definitely wasn't some corporate superstar. I was just one of the senior employees who had been around long enough to know how everything worked. Honestly, I liked the job. Retail had its challenges, but I enjoyed helping customers, training new hires, and solving problems. The people I worked with were good people. The biggest problem was our manager, Brandon. When Brandon first arrived, corporate absolutely loved him. I understood why. He was in his mid-20s, dressed sharply, spoke with confidence, and always seemed to know exactly what to say around upper management. If you met him for 5 minutes, you'd probably think he was destined to become an executive before he turned 30. The problem was that almost everything impressive about Brandon was surface level. He was great at looking competent. Actually, being competent was a completely different story. While Brandon was busy charming corporate supervisors, the rest of us were keeping the store running. He showed up late surprisingly often, always with an excuse: traffic, oversleeping, car trouble, or a friend who needed help. But everyone knew the truth. Brandon partied constantly. He loved talking about networking events, social gatherings, and industry meetups, and half the time he came into work looking exhausted. Meanwhile, all the unpleasant work somehow landed on someone else's desk. Inventory issues, staff training, scheduling, customer complaints, technical problems. Those responsibilities usually ended up with me or a handful of other experienced employees. At first, I didn't really mind. I was used to being the reliable one. The problem was that Brandon wasn't just avoiding the work, he was taking credit for it. One example always stood out. Our store had developed a much better inventory tracking process. It wasn't anything revolutionary, just a simple system that helped reduce mistakes and identify missing products faster. Several employees contributed ideas. I helped organize the project, my coworker Eric designed the original tracking sheets, and another employee named Jasmine suggested changes that made the whole thing easier to use. It was a true team effort, and it worked. Inventory became easier to manage, shrink numbers improved, and customers got better service because we spent less time fixing mistakes. Then one day, I overheard Brandon explaining the system to a district supervisor. You would have thought he had built it entirely by himself. Every idea suddenly belonged to him. Every improvement was his leadership. Every success was his achievement. At the time, I just shook my head and moved on because, honestly, nobody was surprised anymore. That was Brandon. If something went well, it was because of him. If something went wrong, it was someone else's fault. The frustrating part was that corporate seemed to believe it every single time. As the months passed, Brandon's reputation inside the company kept growing. Supervisors praised him. District leaders complimented him. He talked more and more about bigger opportunities within the company, and you could tell he genuinely believed he was meant for something greater than managing a retail store. Maybe that wouldn't have bothered me so much if he had actually earned it, but most of the store's success came from people whose names corporate had never even heard. People like Eric, people like Jasmine, and people like me. Then one morning, we got word that several corporate representatives would be visiting our location. The entire store went into preparation mode. Everyone cleaned, organized, and double-checked displays. We wanted everything to look perfect. Brandon treated the visit like the biggest day of his life. For an entire week, every conversation somehow came back to making a strong impression. By the time the corporate team arrived, he looked like a politician preparing for a campaign speech. The visit started normally. They toured the store, asked questions, reviewed performance numbers, and looked over operational reports while Brandon led most of the discussion. At first, everything seemed fine. Then he started presenting some of the store improvements, including the inventory system. I remember standing nearby, listening as he explained the project and carefully positioned himself as the mastermind behind the entire thing. Not once did he mention the employees who had actually built it. One of the corporate supervisors looked impressed. "That's a pretty effective system," he said. Brandon smiled, the same smile he always wore when he thought he was winning. "Thank you," he replied. "I spent quite a bit of time developing it." I felt my jaw tighten. It wasn't because I wanted recognition. Honestly, I didn't care about getting praise. What bothered me was watching an entire team's effort disappear in real time. Then something happened that changed everything. The supervisor looked over at me. Maybe because I happened to be standing closest. Maybe because he noticed the expression on my face. To this day, I still don't know. But he asked me a simple question. How long did implementation take? About 6 weeks, I answered honestly. He nodded and asked another question. What was the hardest part? Again, I answered truthfully. The team figuring out which tracking methods worked best. He looked curious. The team? And that was where I made the mistake, or at least, that's how Brandon saw it. I smiled politely and explained that several employees had contributed ideas, that Eric had built the original tracking sheets, that Jasmine had suggested improvements, and that all of us had tested different approaches before settling on the final version. The supervisor immediately became interested. He started asking questions about collaboration and implementation, and before long the conversation shifted away from Brandon and toward the people who had actually built the system. There was no confrontation, no argument, no accusation. I wasn't trying to expose Brandon. I was simply answering questions honestly. But the second I looked over at him, I knew something had changed. His smile was gone. His expression barely moved, but his eyes had. If you've ever dealt with a narcissist, you know that look. The moment they realize the attention has shifted away from them, the moment they feel their carefully crafted image being threatened. The meeting continued. Everyone stayed professional and nobody said a word. But I could feel it. The atmosphere had changed. For the first time since Brandon became our manager, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I had accidentally made an enemy. The corporate visit ended successfully, the supervisors left, and everyone went back to work. On the surface, nothing seemed different. But later that afternoon, I noticed Brandon watching me from across the store. He wasn't glaring. He didn't look angry. He was just watching me, almost as if he were reevaluating something. That uneasy feeling stayed with me during the drive home. I kept replaying the meeting in my head. Every question, every answer, every reaction. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Brandon wasn't upset because I had embarrassed him. He was upset because I had interrupted the story he wanted corporate to believe. And people like Brandon don't forgive that easily. At the time, I hoped I was overthinking it. I hoped I was imagining things. Unfortunately, I wasn't. Because within a week, Brandon started showing me exactly how dangerous a wounded ego could be. And that was only the beginning. Within a week of that corporate visit, things started to change. At first, the changes were subtle enough that I could almost convince myself they were just coincidences. Almost. For years, I had worked a fairly predictable schedule. Brandon knew I had a family. He knew my wife, Sarah, had ongoing medical issues and regular appointments, and he knew I had always arranged my availability around those responsibilities. Suddenly, none of that seemed to matter anymore. I started getting the worst shifts imaginable. I would close one night and be expected to open the next morning. Weekend shifts that I normally wouldn't have been assigned suddenly became my responsibility, and last-minute schedule changes became a regular occurrence. Planning anything outside of work became nearly impossible. The first time it happened, I asked Brandon about it. He gave me a smile. Not a friendly one, but the kind of smile someone gives when they know exactly what they're doing. Just trying to be fair to everybody, he said. The word fair almost made me laugh. Somehow, fairness always seemed to work in favor of Brandon's favorite employees, while making life harder for everyone else, especially me. Then came the denied time off requests. I had submitted 1 week in advance so I could accompany my wife to a medical appointment. Brandon denied it, citing staffing needs. A few days later, he approved a nearly identical request from another employee who had submitted theirs after mine. Coincidentally, or maybe not, that employee spent most of every shift complimenting Brandon and telling him what a great manager he was. I wish I could say that kind of favoritism was unusual, but it wasn't. The longer I stayed there, the more obvious the pattern became. People who fed Brandon's ego got rewarded. People who questioned him got punished. And anyone who threatened the image he had built for himself became a target. By then, I knew exactly which category I belonged to. The scheduling problems were frustrating, but they weren't the worst part. What really got to me was the public criticism. Brandon loved having an audience. If he wanted to correct someone, he could have done it privately like any good manager would. But Brandon never missed an opportunity to turn a small issue into a public performance. Every mistake became a show, and every problem became another chance to remind everyone who was in charge. I still remember one afternoon when a customer complained about an issue with an online order. The situation had absolutely nothing to do with me. I hadn't even been working when it happened. But Brandon waited until several employees were standing nearby before calling me out. "Michael," he said loudly, "this is exactly the kind of thing I've been talking about." I looked at him, genuinely confused, and asked what he meant. Instead of answering, he launched into a lecture right there in front of everyone, speaking as though I had personally caused the problem. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody had to. Everyone knew what he was doing, and I'm pretty sure even Brandon knew it. Solving the issue had never been the point. The point was making me look incompetent. Afterward, one of my coworkers quietly came over and told me, "That wasn't your fault." I nodded and said, "I know." But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. Public humiliation rarely does, especially when you're expected to smile, stay professional, and pretend everything is fine because your paycheck depends on it. And at that point in my life, my paycheck mattered more than ever. Sarah had been dealing with health problems for nearly a year. It wasn't life-threatening, thankfully, but it was serious enough that doctor visits, treatments, and medication had become a regular part of our lives. Every month seemed to bring another medical bill, another unexpected expense, another financial setback. On top of that, we had 2 kids, a mortgage, and all the ordinary responsibilities that come with raising a family. Those obligations didn't disappear just because my manager had decided to make my life miserable. There were plenty of nights when I would sit alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at our finances and trying to work out the numbers. I kept asking myself the same questions. Could I quit? Maybe. Could I find another job quickly? Maybe. Could I afford even a short gap in income? Absolutely not. That was the trap. Brandon didn't know every detail of my personal situation, but he understood enough to know I wasn't in a position to simply walk away. People like him have a strange ability to sense who has options and who doesn't, and they know exactly how to use that information. As the months went by, the retaliation became more creative. Brandon would assign me responsibilities without giving me any actual authority. If something went wrong, I got blamed. If things went well, someone else received the credit. Sometimes both happened on the same day. One incident in particular still sticks with me. A new employee had been struggling with the store's inventory procedures, so I spent several hours helping him learn the system. It took extra time and effort, but eventually he got comfortable with it. The following week, Brandon praised that employee during a staff meeting, then congratulated himself for creating such an effective training environment. My name never came up, not once. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow it still bothered me every time it happened. The truth was, it wasn't just happening to me. Brandon treated the entire store like it was his personal brand. Every success belonged to him. Every failure belonged to someone else. The employees who figured this out adapted quickly. Some became professional flatterers, constantly praising his leadership and acting like every decision he made was brilliant. Honestly, I couldn't even blame them. People do what they have to do to survive. If complimenting Brandon made your work life easier, many decided it was a small price to pay. I remember one employee in particular who rarely did much actual work, but constantly talked about how visionary Brandon was. Somehow, that employee always received the best shifts, the best opportunities, and endless praise. Meanwhile, some of the hardest working people in the store were almost completely ignored. The message couldn't have been clearer. Competence didn't matter nearly as much as loyalty to Brandon. That kind of environment slowly wears people down. One by one, the good employees started leaving. Some transferred to different locations, others quit altogether, and a few simply got tired of fighting battles they knew they could never win. Whenever someone left, Brandon would act genuinely confused. He'd talk about how unfortunate it was, complain about how difficult it had become to find dedicated employees, and insist that nobody wants to work anymore. The complete lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. One evening after closing, a few coworkers and I stayed behind finishing paperwork, and eventually the conversation drifted toward Brandon. Nobody spoke loudly because nobody wanted trouble, but once people started sharing their experiences, it became obvious that I wasn't imagining any of it. One employee described being blamed for a mistake Brandon himself had made. Another talked about being publicly embarrassed in front of customers. Someone else explained how Brandon dismissed their ideas, only to present those exact same ideas later as his own. The stories kept coming. Different people, different situations, but always the same pattern. That conversation changed something for me. Up until then, a part of me had wondered whether I was taking things too personally or whether I was simply being overly sensitive. After hearing everyone else's experiences, that doubt disappeared. Brandon wasn't targeting me because of a misunderstanding. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was simply who he was. You'd think that realization would have made things easier, but it actually made them harder. Because now I knew the truth, and I still couldn't do anything about it. For a while, I tried standing up for myself. Not aggressively, just professionally. If Brandon blamed me for something I hadn't done, I corrected the record. If he misrepresented a situation, I calmly explained what had actually happened. It wasn't dramatic. It was basic self-defense. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a mistake. Every single time I pushed back, Brandon escalated. Every correction became evidence that I had an attitude problem. Every disagreement became proof that I wasn't a team player. One afternoon, he called me into his office. The conversation started politely enough, but it quickly turned into another lecture. According to Brandon, I wasn't positive enough, I wasn't supportive enough, and I needed to improve my attitude. I remember sitting there listening to him and suddenly realizing something. The outcome of that conversation had been decided before I had even walked into the room. It wasn't feedback. It wasn't coaching. It wasn't a genuine discussion. It was punishment. The facts didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was Brandon maintaining control. When I walked out of that office, I felt completely exhausted, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you're playing a game where someone else wrote all the rules, and those rules were never designed for you to win. That was when the most important realization of this entire story finally hit me. I wasn't going to beat Brandon by confronting him. I wasn't going to beat him by exposing him. I wasn't going to beat him by proving that I was right. Other employees had already tried versions of those strategies, and most of them were gone. Brandon was still there, still getting praised, still climbing the corporate ladder, and still winning. If I wanted things to change, I needed a different approach. At the time, I didn't know exactly what that approach would be, but I knew one thing for certain. Fighting Brandon head-on wasn't working, and if I kept doing it, sooner or later I would end up just like everyone else who had challenged him, walking out the door. So I stopped trying to beat him at his own game. And that decision ended up changing everything. The moment I stopped trying to fight Brandon directly, something interesting happened. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually think clearly. Up until then, every single day had been spent reacting to schedule changes, reacting to criticism, reacting to whatever new problem Brandon decided to create. I was always on the defensive, always trying to survive the next shift. But once I accepted that confronting him wasn't going to change anything, I started paying closer attention. And the more I observed Brandon, the more I realized that his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his ego. Everything in Brandon's life seemed to revolve around it. Every conversation, every decision, and every relationship somehow came back to his need to feel admired. He craved validation the way most people crave coffee in the morning. Once I understood that, I slowly started changing the way I interacted with him. Not all at once and not in any obvious way. It was gradual and subtle. The first time I complimented him, it almost felt absurd. We had just finished a store meeting where Brandon had spent nearly 10 minutes talking about sales goals and company strategy. As everyone was leaving, I casually mentioned that he was actually pretty good at presenting information. That was it. Nothing over the top, nothing that sounded fake. But I noticed his reaction immediately. His posture straightened, his expression softened, and for a brief second he looked genuinely pleased. That tiny reaction told me everything I needed to know, so I kept doing it. Not constantly, just enough. Whenever Brandon handled a difficult situation reasonably well, I'd acknowledge it. When he talked about company strategy, I'd act interested. When he brought up his career ambitions, I'd encourage him. The transformation was almost unbelievable. The same man who had spent months treating me like a personal enemy slowly started treating me like an ally. Not because he had suddenly developed respect for me, but because he enjoyed feeling admired. Or at least, what he believed was admiration. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had tried convincing Brandon to simply treat me fairly, and that had gotten me nowhere. The moment I started feeding his ego instead, everything suddenly became easier. The retaliation slowed down, then mostly disappeared. He became friendlier and more relaxed around me. Sometimes he would even pull me aside just to talk, although those conversations almost always revolved around one subject: himself. Talking to Brandon was like listening to someone narrate the future version of their own life. He constantly spoke about where he was headed, how his talents were being wasted managing a single retail store, and how he belonged at a much higher level within the company. Depending on the day, he imagined himself in corporate leadership, regional management, or some executive position. The exact title changed, but the underlying belief never did. He genuinely thought he was destined for greatness and that everyone else was simply too slow to recognize it. One afternoon after closing, we were sitting in the back office finishing paperwork when Brandon leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "You know what the problem is?" he asked. I already knew it wasn't really a question, but I played along anyway. "What?" I asked. "This company doesn't promote people fast enough," he said. "I've done everything they've asked. Sales are up, performance is good, and honestly, I should already be working at corporate." I remember pretending to think about it for a second before replying, "You'd probably do well there." The smile on his face appeared instantly. It wasn't because I had said anything particularly insightful. It was because I had confirmed exactly what he already wanted to believe. From that moment on, Brandon started opening up even more. He talked about his career plans, his professional ambitions, rumors he had heard about opportunities within the company, and the people he thought were holding him back. Every conversation gave me a clearer picture of how his mind worked. Eventually, I realized something important. Brandon wasn't actually obsessed with managing people. He was obsessed with status. Being a manager was simply the vehicle that gave him the recognition he wanted. If something more prestigious became available, he would chase it without a second thought. That realization planted a small idea in the back of my mind. At first, it was nothing more than a possibility, but over time, it started to grow. Months passed, and during that time, one of our strongest employees decided to leave. His name was Eric, the same Eric who had helped create the inventory system years earlier. He was smart, dependable, and respected by everyone in the store. Exactly the kind of employee any competent manager would fight to keep. Brandon drove him away anyway. The final straw was something incredibly minor. Another scheduling conflict, another unnecessary public criticism session, another pointless display of authority. Eric handed in his notice shortly afterward. I still remember watching him clean out his locker. The store felt different after he left. Quieter somehow, almost smaller, like we had lost something important. And honestly, we had. That night, I sat in my car after work longer than usual, just thinking. For months, I had watched good people leave while Brandon continued getting rewarded. I had kept hoping that sooner or later someone at corporate would notice what was happening, but nothing ever changed. That was the moment I stopped waiting for fairness. I stopped expecting corporate to figure it out on their own, and I stopped hoping Brandon would suddenly become self-aware. None of those things were going to happen. If change was ever going to come, it would come from understanding Brandon better than he understood himself. By then, I was getting very good at that. A few weeks later, the opportunity I had been waiting for finally appeared. A position had opened up at corporate headquarters. It wasn't some massive executive role, but It was a legitimate job at the company's main office, the kind of opportunity Brandon had been fantasizing about for years. The moment he heard about it, he became completely obsessed. He talked about it during meetings, over lunch breaks, while closing the store. Honestly, it was all he could think about. Most people probably would have stayed neutral, but I didn't. Every chance I got, I encouraged him. "You should apply," I'd say. "I think you'd be a great fit." Sometimes I'd even tell him, "Honestly, you're probably overqualified for this store." The comments worked exactly the way I expected them to. Each one made Brandon a little more confident, a little more ambitious, and a little more convinced that he was destined for bigger things. Eventually, he stopped talking about whether he should apply and started talking as if getting the position was inevitable. In his mind, the decision had already been made. Watching it unfold was fascinating. The more confident Brandon became, the less careful he became. His arrogance started growing beyond the limits it had before. He interrupted people more often, brushed off criticism more quickly, and bragged about himself more openly. It was almost as though his future promotion already existed in his imagination, and the rest of the world just hadn't caught up yet. Then, one morning, he walked into the store wearing the biggest smile I had ever seen. I knew immediately, before he even opened his mouth. He had gotten the job. Corporate headquarters had selected him. Just like that, it looked like the villain had won. Brandon spent the next few weeks acting like a celebrity. Corporate leaders called him personally. District managers congratulated him. Co-workers shook his hand and wished him luck. He soaked up every second of the attention. And I won't lie, part of me was frustrated, maybe even disappointed. After everything he had done, he was being rewarded once again. It felt unfair, the same way everything involving Brandon always seemed unfair. On his final day at the store, he gave a farewell speech. Most of it focused on himself, his accomplishments, his future, and how excited he was for the next chapter of his career. I remember standing there listening and wondering if he had ever truly understood the people around him. Honestly, I don't think he had. When he finally walked out the door, everyone smiled and wished him luck. But the second he was gone, the atmosphere inside the store changed almost instantly. You could actually feel the tension disappear. People relaxed. Conversations became easier. Employees laughed more. Nobody felt like they had to look over their shoulder before speaking honestly. For the first time in a long while, work felt normal again. A few days later, corporate asked me to step in as interim manager while they searched for a permanent replacement. At first, it was only supposed to be temporary, but I accepted. And almost immediately, something happened that surprised me. People started talking, really talking. Not the careful, guarded conversations we used to have under Brandon, but genuine, honest conversations. Employees shared stories I had never even heard before. One person talked about being humiliated in front of customers. Another described having their ideas stolen. Someone else admitted they had spent months secretly looking for another job because of Brandon. The stories kept coming, and with each one, the picture became clearer. Brandon hadn't just hurt a handful of people. He had damaged the entire culture of the store. And now that everyone finally felt safe enough to speak openly, the truth was pouring out. The strangest part was that nobody seemed interested in revenge. They didn't want payback. They just wanted a better place to work. So that's what we focused on. Instead of leading through fear, we focused on communication. Instead of rewarding favoritism, we rewarded performance. Instead of protecting egos, we focused on solving problems. The changes themselves were simple, nothing revolutionary, but the results were almost immediate. Within a few weeks, morale improved noticeably. Employees started sharing ideas again. People helped one another more often. Problems were solved faster, and perhaps most importantly, nobody felt like they had to worship the manager just to be treated fairly. Before long, the store's numbers started improving too. Sales increased, customer satisfaction improved, and operational performance got better across the board. The store became stronger, not because I was some incredible leader, but because the team finally had the freedom to do the jobs they had always been capable of doing. That was when I realized something important. Brandon had never been carrying the store had been carrying Brandon. And before long, everyone else was going to realize it too. Unfortunately for Brandon, his promotion had finally given him exactly what he had always wanted, a much bigger audience. And that turned out to be the worst thing that could have happened to him. The higher he climbed, the more convinced he became that he was untouchable. And that belief was about to destroy everything. For the first couple of weeks after Brandon left, I barely thought about him. I was simply too busy. Running the store was very different from merely helping to run it. There were schedules to organize, employee concerns to handle, reports to complete, and what felt like 100 little problems that popped up every single day. The funny thing was that I actually enjoyed it. Not because the work was easy, but because it felt honest. When something went wrong, we fixed it. When someone had a good idea, we listened. When an employee needed help, we helped them. It was simple, the kind of leadership Brandon always talked about but never actually practiced. As the weeks passed, corporate started noticing the changes. Nothing dramatic at first, just small comments about improved performance, requests for updates, and questions about what we were doing differently. The truth was that we weren't doing anything revolutionary. We had simply removed the constant tension that Brandon had created, and people naturally performed better because of it. Meanwhile, Brandon was settling into his new position at corporate headquarters. I only heard bits and pieces through company contacts and mutual acquaintances, but every update sounded exactly the way I expected. He loved the title, the attention, and the prestige. He became increasingly active on social media, posting polished professional photos, pictures from conferences, networking dinners, and corporate events. Every post seemed carefully designed to show the world how important he had become. Honestly, you could practically watch his ego growing through the screen. At first, nobody paid much attention to it. Then came the conference. It was a major gaming industry event attended by publishers, vendors, executives, business partners, and professionals from across the industry. For Brandon, it was basically the perfect environment. Hundreds of influential people, endless networking opportunities, a room full of people he wanted to impress. And, as it turned out, the perfect setting for one of the biggest mistakes of his life. The first few social media posts weren't all that unusual. They were arrogant, sure, but that was nothing new. He made a sarcastic comment about one presentation, joked about a speaker, and dismissed one of the industry trends being discussed. Typical Brandon behavior. The problem was that he didn't stop. The more attention his posts received, the more extreme they became. Thoughts that should have stayed in his head ended up online for everyone to see. He mocked speakers. He criticized vendors. He openly insulted presentations and made fun of respected professionals in the industry. Some of the very people he was ridiculing were business partners connected to our company, while others were executives whose organizations worked closely with corporate leadership. Apparently, Brandon never considered that. Or maybe he genuinely believed he was too important for it to matter. Either way, he just kept posting. Then, one afternoon, while I was helping one of my employees reorganize a display in the store, my phone buzzed. The message came from a contact I knew at corporate, someone I had worked with occasionally over the years. The text included several screenshots and one simple question. "Wasn't this your old manager?" I opened the images, and the moment I started reading them, my stomach dropped. Not because I felt sorry for Brandon, but because I immediately realized how serious the situation was. The posts were far worse than I had imagined. They were arrogant, condescending, and genuinely embarrassing. They were the kind of comments that make people wonder how someone like that was ever hired in the first place. I sat there scrolling through screenshot after screenshot, and somehow each one was worse than the last. Suddenly, all those years of watching Brandon chase status and recognition made perfect sense. He had finally made it into the room he had always dreamed of entering. The problem was that he still hadn't learned how to behave once he got there. A few moments later, my contact at corporate sent another message. "I don't think this is going over well." That was probably the understatement of the year. A few hours later, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID actually surprised me. It was Brandon. I hadn't spoken to him since he left the store, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded completely different from the one I remembered. The confidence was gone. The swagger was gone. The certainty that had defined him for years had completely disappeared. For the first time since I had known him, Brandon sounded genuinely scared. He started talking immediately, almost too fast to follow. He explained, justified, and rationalized everything. According to him, people had overreacted. His comments had been misunderstood. Everyone was taking them out of context. The more he talked, the more desperate he sounded. Eventually, it became obvious why he had called. He wasn't really looking for advice. He wanted reassurance. He wanted someone to tell him everything was going to be fine. More than anything, he wanted validation, the same thing he had always wanted. After listening quietly for a minute, I asked him a single question. If you really believe there was nothing wrong with what you posted, then why are you so worried about it? There was silence on the other end of the line. It only lasted a couple of seconds, but it felt much longer. For once, Brandon didn't have an immediate answer. Eventually, he muttered something about office politics, and the conversation came to an awkward end. I put my phone away and went back to work. There wasn't really anything else I could do. The situation was completely out of my hands, and in truth, it always had been. The next day, rumors started circulating throughout the company. HR had become involved. Meetings were taking place. Questions were being asked. The screenshots were spreading, and more people were seeing them. Unlike all the situations Brandon had managed to escape at the store level, this time he couldn't intimidate an employee, manipulate a schedule, or control the conversation. This was different. For the first time, he was dealing with people who cared more about the company's reputation than they cared about his personal charm. A few days later, the news became official. Brandon was gone. He had been terminated. Just like that, the corporate position he had spent years chasing disappeared almost as quickly as he had gotten it. When I heard the news, I didn't celebrate. Honestly, my first reaction wasn't happiness, it was relief. Not because Brandon had lost his job, but because it finally felt like the entire chapter was over. Years of manipulation, years of arrogance, years of watching him continually fail upward, it was finally finished. And the craziest part was that nobody had sabotaged him. Nobody had framed him. Nobody had lied about him. In the end, Brandon had destroyed Brandon. The very same ego that had helped him climb the ladder was ultimately the thing that pushed him off of it. Life moved on surprisingly quickly after that. A few months later, corporate officially offered me the permanent store manager position, and I accepted. The team was happy, I was happy, and most importantly, the store kept improving. Employee retention improved. Customer satisfaction improved. Performance improved. The inventory system that Brandon had once claimed as his own continued working exactly as it was supposed to. The only difference was that now, people actually received credit for the work they contributed. Ideas were shared openly, employees felt heard, and the workplace became healthier. Not perfect, no workplace ever is, but healthy. After everything we had gone through, that felt like a huge victory. Eventually, Brandon became little more than an old story. Every now and then, someone would mention him while talking about how much the store had changed. But for the most part, everyone had moved on. Then, nearly a year after he left, I looked up from the register one afternoon and saw someone walking through the front door. At first, I didn't recognize him. Then I realized who it was. It was Brandon. He looked older, not physically, but emotionally. He looked like someone carrying around a weight he couldn't put down. The confidence was gone. The expensive clothes were gone. Even the way he walked was different. He spotted me almost immediately and slowly made his way over. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The whole moment felt surreal. For years, Brandon had been the most confident person in every room. Now he looked uncomfortable standing in front of one of his former employees. Finally, he broke the silence. He explained that things hadn't worked out after corporate. Finding a new job had been harder than he expected. People talked, references mattered, opportunities disappeared. One setback led to another, and eventually he found himself running out of options. Then he finally asked the question, would I help him get a job? Not another corporate position, not even a management role, any job. Even here, back at the very store he had spent years acting superior to. I looked around the store for a moment. I looked at the employees helping customers, at the team we had rebuilt together, and at the environment we had worked so hard to create. Then I looked back at Brandon. I thought about every conversation we had ever had, every schedule he had sabotaged, every public criticism, every stolen idea, and every good employee he had driven away. Then I remembered the day he took credit for the inventory system, the moment that had started this entire story. Back then, Brandon had believed leadership was about receiving recognition, being admired, and looking important. He had never understood what leadership was actually supposed to be. I took a breath and answered him honestly. I told him that we were looking for people who could genuinely support a team, people who wanted to help others succeed, people who understood that leadership wasn't about taking credit but about earning trust. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him or try to humiliate him. I simply told him that he wasn't the right fit. For the first time since I had known him, Brandon had absolutely nothing to say. There was no comeback, no excuse, and no speech. Just silence. After a few seconds, he quietly thanked me for my time, turned around, and walked out of the store. That was the last time I ever saw him. A lot has happened since then. My wife's health improved, our financial situation became more stable, and the store continued to grow. Several employees who had once considered leaving decided to stay, and some of them even moved into leadership roles of their own. Things worked out. Not because I got revenge or because I somehow outsmarted Brandon, but because I learned something important. People can get surprisingly far through confidence, self-promotion, and carefully managing their image. Sometimes they can even convince everyone around them that they're exceptional. But eventually, character catches up with reputation. And when that happens, reputation usually loses. If there's one lesson I took away from all of this, it's that real leadership isn't about getting the credit. It's about helping other people succeed. The people who never learn that lesson eventually run out of places to hide.